several follow-ups from our showing the 13th. As the Kehillah Racial Equity Team and the Social Action Committee have been working to involve congregants more into what's going on in the field of racial equity in our area. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Seth Koch, who is going to speak about incarceration in North Carolina from the Civil War on, the topic of his latest book. His book, I should say, right?
It's also the latest one.
The latest book and the current book called Lethal State. Seth has a degree from Columbia University, BA, and a PhD.
My name is Seth Koch, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies at UNC. I talked about the history of incarceration, the death penalty, and lynching in North Carolina and the South more broadly.
So hold the microphone. That's good. That's good. Go ahead.
So you want to know who I am? My name is Seth Koch, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies at UNC.
You speak very fast.
I do.
What did you talk about?
I talked about the history of incarceration, the death penalty, and lynching in North Carolina and the South more broadly.
Very good. Well, what do you think was the important thing of what you gave today?
The most important thing is that when we talk about criminal justice and crime and punishment in our state, in our region, in our country, that we have to do so in the context of history, and that history has to include a conversation about the legacies of enslavement. Thank you. Right, Atlanta is burned to the ground, and there are people who are coming with good and bad motives to sort of rebuild and reinvest and perhaps profit. But there are lots of people too who come to help African American people integrate themselves into the Southern life, into a functional Southern economy, into a functional Southern political economy. And in North Carolina, one of the prerequisites for re-entering the United States is not only to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gives citizenship and acknowledges the personhood of African American people, but is also to rewrite their constitution. And one of the important things that happens in this constitutional rewrite in 1868 is that we build a prison. If I trip over this and fall, don't worry, stay seated. I'll get back up, it might be slow. And building a prison is considered to be a progressive reform. Prisons were one of the kind of Enlightenment era experiments that Americans in the sort of post-revolutionary era start to experiment with. And they're considered reformist, not only because they're supposed to inspire penitence, right? The penitentiary is supposed to be a space for quiet reflection, setting aside the fact that silence was often enforced at the end of a whip, and that speaking to other inmates, for instance, might have you severely punished. But it was supposed to be a place of reflection, perhaps even of worship, and crucially, a place of labor. The main debate about the function of prisons in America, which takes place in the 1820s and 30s, and it's an argument between basically Philadelphia and New York. And the argument is whether the labor that prisoners do happens in a group or it happens individually. And that is all. Everyone agrees that labor takes place, everyone agrees that it takes place in silence. The question is congregate labor versus individual labor. And the idea of labor is very much built into the idea of the prison. The very first prison in America, Walnut Street Prison, which starts operating in Philadelphia in 1790, has laborers and road crews that are sent out into Philadelphia to pick up rubbish. And the experiment fails because they're not in uniforms and they just run away. So hence the invention of the strikes.
What was done with prisoners before they were prisoners?
What was done with prisoners before they were prisoners? Well, we had the radical idea that a lot of people were the responsibilities of their families. And so they were given, their families' parents were instructed, neighbors and relatives were instructed to care for them and take responsibility for them. There were jails that existed, but imprisonment as punishment in a jail didn't exist. People who did something bad were publicly beaten and humiliated. You can imagine the sort of medieval style punishments that many of us are familiar with just from sort of books and TV, nailing your ear to a post, branding you, whipping you the stocks. And one of the transitions that happens in America, let's say between the 1770s and the early 1800s, we have this explosion in population growth, especially in our cities. And the punishments like the branding and the whipping, the ducking stool, things of that nature, these are intended to be painful and they're intended to be humiliating. And the humiliation part starts to fade a little bit when we start to be more anonymous as citizens. The idea is that if you live in a community like this one, a small community, in 1776, let's say when the revolution's happening, there's not a town in Massachusetts that has more than 1,000 people in it. And so in general, you kind of know your neighbors. And if you're being humiliated in front of your neighbor, you have an incentive to change your behavior because they see you the next day and the next day and the next day. The idea is that once you don't know your neighbors anymore, humiliating punishments don't work. That you don't care about their regard because you don't know them. And so you need to find a different kind of punishment that doesn't rely quite so much on pain. Then, of course, we also have Enlightenment thinkers who are starting to say, people should be valued, we need to care for bodies as temples, we need to be more thoughtful about how we do this. And there are some influential philosophers. There's an Italian philosopher, I sort of think of him as the most influential philosopher no one's ever heard of. His name is Cesare Beccaria, and he writes something called On Crimes and Punishments. It's translated into English in 1767. Adults are mingling freely. Eventually, we used to experiment with segregation between men and women for reasons which is important for reasons you can imagine. Prisoners escape, they die, they are malnourished. We understand now that solitary confinement is torture. And we still, of course, I think 80,000 people today are in solitary confinement all the time. So we've had, I'm a humanities guy. I don't know the difference between 1790 and 2018. It's somewhere larger than 200, but less than 300, right? We understood right from the beginning that the system was failing, and we just kept tinkering with it without thinking about its fundamental structure and how to change it. The United States insists that southern states, to demonstrate their commitment to nation building, must have prisons, and North Carolina is among them. Most southern states don't have prisons before the Civil War. Can you imagine why?
Slaves.
Anyone you could imagine needing to be locked up was already confined on a plantation, in the household of a white enslaver, in the business of a white enslaver. And the association that had been built up over about 200 years, we really start associating race and enslavement in the 1660s. That association was so strong that the very idea that a white person's labor would be compelled was abhorrent to a lot of white people who said as much. We know this because they said so. I would rather die than be a slave, says one influential white person in North Carolina, as the state rejects by referenda 3 times the idea of building a prison. But this is considered a progressive reform. And I will mention that when we do write that 1868 Constitution and ratify it and re-enter the United States, that Constitution says the prison must be self-sustaining, which places a burden on the prisoners themselves from day one to ensure that their confinement is supported by they, that they are asked to build the temporary cells that they live in while they are required to build the prison itself. And I'll mention this in more detail in a moment, but the prison takes 20 years to build because as soon as there's a prison population, which is 80% African American, as soon as there's a prison population, they're leased out to the Western Carolina Railroad Corporation to begin building the railroad. So they're not even present. And the law says that the only people who can work on the roads are nonviolent offenders. We wouldn't call them that. They say if you've killed someone, you will be confined in central prison. And this is the prison that's in Raleigh. It's a rare prison because it's really right in the middle of Raleigh. Most prisons are 100 miles, most people are imprisoned 100 miles from their home. And prisons tend to be in these rural spaces, and there's a lot of interesting work on the sort of effect of prisons on these rural places, and things like apportionment and other questions like that. And there's still one wall remaining from that original prison. The rest has fallen over and been rebuilt. But we had people who were on death row, released from death row to go work on the road. The rules weren't followed particularly well because of the urgency of getting that labor done. And I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. As you probably already know, and certainly would know, I believe, from the 13th, we do ratify this Constitution. There's a lot that we don't know about the 1860s and the early 1870s, but we know that there is an ongoing conversation, conflict, both with words and deeds, over who will control the politics in North Carolina and other southern states. This is a question of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, coming down with the Freedmen's Bureau, trying to establish black educational institutions, schools, trying to encourage black political activity and support black political activity. And we do have a flowering of black political activity, demonstrating immediately that the idea that black people were not suitable to participating in a meaningful way is a falsehood invented by people who were interested in enslaving them. And we have black political representatives from North Carolina and others who go to Congress. We have lots of local black political activity. Literacy rates don't rise a great deal, but they do rise, and formerly enslaved people and their children show a great interest in education. This is this real moment. But then we come to the sort of failure of this moment of possibility with the Compromise of 1876 and the sort of the vanquishing, for the most part, of Republican Party politics in the American South. And this is one of those things, I won't pretend to understand it, but those of us who have, I guess all of us here have, I believe, lived through the sort of hanging chads and the deal making in Florida in the 2000 election, this is, and it's anticipating that very much a smoky room where Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican, Samuel Tilden's the Democrat, they're separated by a handful of votes. It's the kind of election where ballot boxes are literally being thrown into the rivers and the swamps in New Orleans, and people are killing each other over who they're voting for. There's literally a smoky back room full of white men with cigars. They agree to give Florida's electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the United States government pulling the military occupation out of the, again, and this begins racial separation that can be tolerated under the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment guarantees your right to vote will not be abridged based on your race or previous condition of servitude. So they know that they can't ban voting, but they can segregate schools, which the 1876 Constitution does, and they can ban interracial marriage, which this Constitution also does. So the early seeds of the very common tropes of segregation that we see in the 20th century, segregated schools, and hostility towards interracial relationships of any kind, but especially marriage. And of course that won't be tested until generations and generations later. It also provides for convict leasing. And this is kind of the core of 13th, right? Because of that little clause that gets added into the 13th Amendment. Right? And I sometimes try to imagine, we don't really know a lot about the deliberations that resulted in that little clause, except, and I'm blanking here because I'm speaking in front of people, but except on conviction, duly convicted of a crime, right? You cannot enslave anyone. And I just try to imagine the articulation. And I think a lot of times when we think about enslavement, because it seems so shockingly horrible to us, it's very difficult to imagine, and I think you might get accused of being kind of a radical activist if you say, well, imprisonment is just another form of enslavement. Calm down, they committed a crime. But people in the room were saying, we need this labor, and we need a mechanism to get it back, because we have lost it. We don't need to be radical lefty academic types to invent a trope about imprisonment. Prisons were built, particularly in the South, I'll say that again. Prisons were built in the North before the Civil War to bind labor. Labor was an inherent part of them. Prisons were built in the South after the Civil War to confine formerly enslaved people and to extract their labor. And it's not just me saying it, it's the people who built the prisons saying it. And so that clause in the 13th Amendment allows us to do that within the constitutional construct that says that we can't actually have enslavement in this country. We can have it only under certain circumstances, is the way in which the amendment is read today and was read then. There's a line in Gone with the Wind, it's in both the book and the movie as far as I know. Scarlett O'Hara happily talks about getting convict labor on, is it Tara? I won't do my Scarlett O'Hara voice, but you can get them for next to nothing and feed them for dirt cheap. And so to the capitalist, with no concern for the people who's laboring for them, it really is a great deal. You pay basically nothing, and when they die, you get another one. And enslavement, we know more now than we did recently, did not provide a great deal of protection for enslaved people. I think we like to imagine that the value of the enslaved person, their monetary value, somehow protected them from violence, because we think, as we reason, you wouldn't harm this piece of human property that is doing work for you. But we know that's not true, because we know that enslavers used violence against enslaved people to provoke work and to set an example to make other enslaved people work. We know that in North Carolina, for instance, the death penalty was used against enslaved people, eliminating that human property, in their view, because it had an effect on other enslaved people. And the early death penalty statutes in North Carolina that are written say that the death penalty exists, quote, to the terror of other slaves. And enslavers are encouraged to bring enslaved people to public executions to see them happen, so their enslaved population will be more tractable. Yes?
I'm just curious on background, what the population, the enslaved population was in North Carolina relative to other states. And was there a difference because of just terrain or how things were produced here in terms of the labor they actually did relative to other states, like cotton picking versus, you know?
That's a good question. I'll answer it in two ways. First is I don't know. Like, that's not my area. So we had a smaller population of enslaved people than many other southern states, if not most. And the average number of enslaved people who were enslaved by any given enslaver was smaller. So the raw numbers were smaller and the per enslaver number was smaller. And I'm trying to train myself. I used the word slaves and slave owners for many years, and I think now I'm trying to train myself to use my language in a way that acknowledges the humanity of enslaved people. And so I'll say enslavers, which tells us that there's an action happening to an enslaved person. An enslaved person is not just a slave inherently in and of itself a slave. They're being acted on to take on that status. And I think that language is important, but sometimes it means that I'm sort of get a little tongue-tied in describing these relationships. We didn't have the big plantations like Tara, or like they had in Virginia. We didn't have this sort of intensive operations like the indigo operations in South Carolina or rice in South Carolina. Indigo and rice cultivation were known as being particularly brutal because when you're standing in water and rice paddies, it's mosquitoes. Indigo is boiling hot to boil this material to make this dye. So the smaller holdings in North Carolina meant that there might not have been the kind of systematicness about enslavement that we can conjure up when we think of a mental picture. The largest slave owner in North Carolina was Cameron, the Cameron family for many generations, and of course we know them because the Cameron Avenue runs right through the middle of UNC campus. And I wouldn't want to guess how many enslaved people were owned by that family at any given time. I don't think it would have exceeded 200 to 300, which is a large number of people to be enslaved. But I'm getting nervous now because I'm being filmed, and I don't. Now I'm publicly confessing my ignorance instead of it being revealed later, which might be good. And I think too that the western part of the state did not have as much enslaving of people, and that may have been because of its geography. We know that there were some underground railroad pathways that went through that space. There's a mountain out there that was called by the locals N-word Mountain, and people debate over whether it was because of its appearance. It has sort of dark stone formations on it, or whether it was because it was used as an underground railroad passageway because of the inhospitable nature of this space. It might have offered shelter to people who were trying to escape enslavement. But we know that poor white people in the mountains of North Carolina and the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky were hostile to the slave-owning class, the enslaving class, because they understood it's one of those moments of opportunity in political history that seems to always end up with people choosing racial loyalties over class loyalties, that they understood that they were being impoverished in part by a political system and a social and capital system that was built on enslavement and not built on the kind of labor that it wanted to do. But this is what white supremacy does, is it offers white people who are struggling something in exchange for their struggle, and says, we might not give you an opportunity to build wealth, we might not give you an opportunity to build generational wealth, but we will give you your whiteness and tell you that it makes you special. So work for us, put in work for us. And this in a way is the story of the Confederacy, of people fighting on behalf of a system that didn't benefit them and that harmed a whole other population. That's a good question. There's a great book called Slavery in North Carolina, so that will be easy to remember. And it was written many years ago, and I don't know that another one has been written, but it's very detailed and would be worth tracking down if that's of interest. And I think we should all educate ourselves about that, myself included. I need to go back to that book, which I've only read. The great secret of academia is all we do is look at the index and read little pieces, right? We don't do enough cover to cover reading. And so again, I brutalize this slide, but Jim Crow going from, let's say, 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, to, I put 1964 because it's the Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act will follow in 1965. And then we can talk, of course, about the tail end of this, right? Because the story in a way that we're concerned with today is this post-60s era when we have in name restored the vote to all people. We have in name desegregated public facilities, and we've made some sort of claim with laws that we've passed about our values and our goals as a nation. And obviously, no one would be in this room if you felt comfortable that that promise and that claim had been fully realized. In 1900, we amend the Constitution to add a literacy test and a poll tax. Literacy test would be up to the clerk or the official, but you would have to demonstrate somehow that you can read. Often the thing that needed to be read in a literacy test was a passage from the Constitution, and so we have stories, apocryphal or not, that are told about African Americans with limited literacy memorizing the entire Constitution and reciting it before a white clerk of court who then tells them that they got something wrong in the third line of this particular part and thus excludes them. Whether or not those stories are true, they tell us that white local officials were important in enforcing anti-voting intentions, and they demonstrate the power of whiteness in these particular contexts. There's also a poll tax, meaning you have to pay to vote, but both the literacy test and the poll tax have a grandfather clause, which says that if your grandfather, and that the phrase grandfather is expansive, it doesn't mean your actual grandfather, it means an ancestor. If your ancestor was able to vote, then you can. And so what that means is that poor white men, it's just men, right? Poor white men who can't read, but can show that they've got a grandfather of some kind, are able to vote. So this is an example of one of those rules and restrictions that does in fact threaten harm to poor white people as well, who are then given a little out, given a little valve to cast their votes if they wish to. And this is all sort of at the discretion of these local officials. What that means is that the vote can be restricted as much as possible within the constitutionality of the 15th Amendment, because you're not telling people they can't vote on account of their race, you're simply telling them they can't vote if they can't afford to, or they can't vote because they can't read. And if you're doing that at the same time as you're denying people an education, it works very well if your job is to suppress the vote among a certain population, among African American people. After the Civil War as well, and particularly in the redemption period, and accelerating in the early 1900s, we have a sequence where behaviors that are associated due to stereotypes and racism, behaviors that are associated with African American people become criminalized. Vagrancy, which would be your inability to demonstrate that you have a job, sometimes by simply not having money in your pocket, and vagrancy is the criminalization of poverty. Loitering, again, not having a job, or appearing not to. These behaviors are criminalized. Previously criminal behaviors that are associated with blackness are moved from misdemeanors to felonies. These are what are known in the South as pig laws. Stealing a pig, stealing a chicken, stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family. People don't steal pigs to sell them on the pig black market. They sell a pig to kill it and feed their starving family, right? You don't steal a chicken to display it on your mantle. You sell a chicken because you need to eat. So criminalizing behaviors that were a natural response to impoverishment and exclusion, and then making those behaviors felonies. And then, and this is the crucial part, making felonies cause for disfranchisement. And we're all familiar with felon disfranchisement. I think today 38 states at least have some form of it. In North Carolina, you do lose your right to vote if you commit a felony, and you don't get it back until you are done with your probation or parole. And I believe, and I haven't looked into this in detail, and I have not, so I'm not satisfied with this. My belief is that you also have to re-register, so you're not automatically registered again. So what that means is that I know, and this is just from me talking to people who had committed felonies and didn't, we're looking forward to voting. There's a lot of confusion about whether you need to re-register, and then of course when we don't have same-day registration, it means that confusion might not be resolved over the course of, congressional election spans, presidential election spans. So people are still being disfranchised after they're done doing all the work that they need to do in order to finish the disposition of their sentence. And North Carolina creates that law in 1901. It's important to say that the idea of disenfranchising felons is old, right? It's the sort of social death that you might have experienced in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. The idea that you can no longer participate in the polis if you have sinned against it, you've committed a crime, usually it'd be something very serious like treason. You don't get to vote, you don't get to participate anymore. So the idea is old, but its application in this very specific way, within this very specific context, in the post-Civil War American South, and eventually throughout the nation, is very much tied to a very deliberate plan to make sure that black people that formerly enslaved people and their descendants are not able to vote or can vote only with difficulty. Not in North Carolina, but there are some states that actually create laws that say that black people have to have a white employer and demonstrate that employment with documentation.
Wow.
If you are not able to demonstrate that employment, you will be arrested and assigned to a white employer. Because debt is rampant, and because debt is a legally punishable offense, and you asked about sort of early prisons and jails, one of the successful experiments around jails, in my view, in sort of early America, in the America of the mid-late 1700s, is the idea of jails where you are only confined at night, so you can leave during the day and work. And we sort of have some models like this, but if you're jailed for debt, and we see this all the time, we see someone who gets a $200 parking ticket, they get court costs, and then they're jailed because they can't afford to pay the court costs, and then they lose their job that they might have used to pay the fines, and it's befuddles the imagination of how someone thought the system would work. Someone in the 1700s knew that you needed to release that person during the day so they could work. And then they would save the money and pay back the debt, and then they would be released from jail. The jail was there to make sure that they were there every morning to wake up and go to work. Jails now function in a very different way. But there would be white employers and landowners who needed labor who would go to courtrooms and offer to pay the court costs or the fines for poor people who could not afford those court costs, and in exchange the judge would assign the debt to that person. The debt would no longer go to the state, it would be owed to the employer, and then the person would have to work for the employer under the employer's terms in order to get around their debt or to pay back their debt. And so we have employers literally showing up to courtrooms as if they're job fairs and getting employees bound to them by legal action, by judges who are tying them into those situations. The directness of it and they were not subtle about their intentions at all. And I think over time we've sort of forgotten how direct the pathway was from race-based enslavement to race-based bound labor. And of course you all know about other systems such as sharecropping or crop liens that bind agricultural workers to the land that they're working on, bind their families to that land and to the white employers who own it. By 1920, 3/4 of American states have some kind of felon disfranchisement law. And that takes about, in 1850, just 1/3 of the states do. So there's a shift there that's significant that tells us something about the new goals of employers and the state governments that support them after the Civil War. There's a couple kinds of bound labor that are slightly different, although often they bleed over into one another. Convict leasing is when prisoners are rented by state prisons to private individuals and corporations. There are sort of remarkable stories, and I never say a story is remarkable before you tell it, but there are remarkable stories about early groups of imprisoned people in southern states literally walking in the front door of the prison and then out the back to the people who had enslaved them just years before. Nathan Bedford Forrest employs the entire prison population in Georgia in 1878, maybe? I'll get that wrong, so don't check it, but it's very close. You'll know Nathan, you'll recognize his name because he started the Klan in Stone Mountain and was an influential Confederate soldier higher up. Again, my Civil War stuff is kind of hazy. So the people who actually enslaved people were moving in a very direct and bright line into being their employers, but with those people being titularly enslaved by the prison or by the prison system and bound to work on their land instead. And needless to say, when a prison which has at least a modicum of responsibility to care for the people who are staying in the prison, and I say modicum meaning that the seriousness with which administrators and others took their charges varied. And sometimes even when those administrators were serious about keeping people healthy and alive, they failed. But you can imagine the way in which even that sort of slender obligation dissipates entirely when that person is sent to a private employer. And so I started mentioning earlier and then trailed off, as is my habit, that the meager protection that having value, that protection that an enslaved person might have, a person who was incarcerated and leased out did not have. And there's an infamous line in a book which takes its title from this line that I will reveal at some kind of prison conference in the early 1900s, someone saying, "This is great. when we had slaves, we had to feed them. Now, when one of these guys dies, we just get another. One dies, get another. And so life was very cheap for these imprisoned people who were being leased out. Often the price of the rental was just to promise to feed and clothe. And so in North Carolina, if the state has to have a self-sustaining prison system, in the minds of administrators and politicians, it's a great deal. You just give over the cost of maintaining that prisoner to a private employer. There is no law that says you have to keep them alive or keep them healthy. You just turn over that responsibility. And as long as you keep writing laws and enforcing laws that provide you with a flow of labor, you can keep sending that labor directly out to others who need it. By the early 1920s and 30s, North Carolina at least has transitioned to the chain gang, which is to say that the sort of states started to notice that they were giving all this labor away to private corporations that they could be using themselves. And so that, and there was some concern from activists about the conditions that prisoners were being held under. But the economic calculus just made sense to start using chain gang labor instead of convict lease labor. These look very similar, they operate in very similar ways, but one is state use of the labor itself, the other is leasing out to private corporations. And chain gangs, in a way, are also enabled by the fact that states are functioning a little better in the 20s and 30s than they are in the 1870s and the 1880s and 90s. And so they have the kind of resources and staffing to at least make a gesture at supervision and provision of clothing and things of that nature. This is an image from Western North Carolina of members of a chain gang working on the Western Carolina Railroad. The railroad itself was a private entity that was bought by the state in the late 1890s, and so it became a state entity. And this railroad was a big deal for North Carolina to connect the West with the East, because we hadn't been able to move goods, I suppose, from the eastern part of the state into the more mountainous places. And so this was an important economic, what's the word I'm looking for, progress to people who were interested in building the state up and building the state's economy up. Between 1875 and 1892, more than half of North Carolina's prisoners are working on this railroad. Prison population is maybe 2,500 around this time, so maybe about 1,000 to 1,500 people. Carol?
Are there any white inmates, or are they all black?
There are some. So 80 to 90% of prisoners at this time are black. The state population is about 37, 38% African American, so it's wildly out of proportion to the percentage of the population. There were white inmates, not as many, but they were also segregated. So there would have been a handful of white crews somewhere, but they kept them separate. And so these men would be living in sort of temporary shelters of some kind while they were laboring. They would generally be portable. They were doing the equivalent of living in trailers. And actually, if you go and you see some of the medium and minimum security prisons in the state today, they look like trailers. They look a lot like elementary schools, actually. You know, those sort of formerly portable trailers that have kind of been set up, right? And they're not air conditioned or cooled adequately, and they have a very sort of temporary feel to them. And my belief is, I don't know this, but my hypothesis is that they were either built in that tradition of mobility, or were once, in fact, trailers that were hitched up to a truck and driven to where they were going and plopped down. I've taught in prisons in the summer, and I've had inmates come in with this huge rings of sweat around their collars and under their arms from being in these very confining places. And that was the case too. They would be chained up together, not able to lie down at night. In the winter, they would be exposed to the elements. In the summer, they'd be exposed to the heat. Because the mosquito problem's not as bad out near Asheville as it would be in the eastern part of the state, but by the 20s and 30s, we have prison farms and camps all over the place. They're making turpentine out of pine, they're chopping onions in farms, they are building our roads. We're the good road state, right? And there's an infamous phrase, bad men make good roads. Okay. Our road system was built, not just in North Carolina, but throughout the South, by inmates in the chain gang. And of course, as I alluded to in that Philadelphia example, the stripes are there because if you escape, they don't want you to be able to blend in. There were lots of escapes, there were lots of mortality. Throughout this period, and by this period I mean the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was at least a 10% mortality for people who were in these camps. By 1898, so the turn of the century, 90% of prisoners have moved from building the railroad to working on farms. Yes.
What are the white things in their hands?
My guess is that they're on like a lunch break, and that these are some sort of plate. They may have had metal, like almost like a camping plate that could be sort of sealed up with some sort of a meal in it.
Well, the guy that's in the front, it looks square.
And they're carrying buckets.
Oh, that's a bucket?
These are buckets. These are some kind of round vessels. I mean, it almost looks like there should be mining or something, but I can't say. I can only guess. And of course, these are shovels here.
Yes.
Yeah. And you can see the guards in the back, and I don't know if you can see what appears to be a long gun there. And the guards appear to have something that looks like a uniform, so we can guess that there's some degree of professionalization there, or at least the gesture of it. Yeah, that's a good question. This is Caledonia Farm, which would become the biggest and most productive prison farm in the state. I mentioned that the Constitution said that the prison system had to be self-sustaining, so they had to produce their own food, as well as produce revenue in order to keep the prison running. And I'm not a numbers guy, so my brain kind of shuts off when I read these ledgers, but you can see the reports of the prison superintendent when they turn them into the governor every couple of years. They have to sort of deliver the state of the prison kind of report, and they're fairly long and dense. I would say for each of them, you get a line or two on, oh, the prisoners are doing great, we've got some new books in the library, and then there's a good 6 inches of just finances. Very focused on the money coming in and going out, and the products coming in and going out. How many pounds of this agricultural product was grown, how much it was sold for. And all that labor had to be productive in one way or another. And another one of these unhappy unions between the Civil War and the post-Civil War, the black women prisoners, who were few in number, particularly in comparison to the men, but one of their earliest jobs was working in a laundry at a home for Confederate veterans outside of Raleigh, actually laundering the clothing of former Confederates, ex-Confederates. Caledonia Farm was an operating plantation on which enslaved people worked, and after the owner of the plantation died before the Civil War, and he hated his family so much he actually left all of the enslaved property, all the enslaved people who were treated as property, and all of the land to his overseer, who, after the Civil War, had a relationship with the formerly enslaved people that they would continue working there in exchange for a modicum of food and clothing and maybe some minor compensation of some kind. So the enslaved people who actually worked at Caledonia as enslaved people, after the Civil War, re-inhabited those roles as people who were working in some sense as free people, but in another sense very much tied by circumstance to this particular space. And ironically, Caledonia later becomes a segregated white prison farm, where only white prisoners will work. This is a view of the interior. Yeah?
Are there any statistics on what proportion of prisoners survived their sentence, completed it, and were actually released?
So are there any statistics on sort of finishing the sentence and then being released? No. One of the ironies I think we're all aware of about imprisonment generally is that we have these rituals that send you into prison that criminologists and philosophers will say are important for sort of social cohesion. So we see, for instance, someone doing the perp walk, and we know that canny people will cover up their handcuffs with their sport coats, or take a mugshot with a smile to try to project some sense of confidence. But we have this ritual where the person is arrested, they're brought into court, which is public. The charges against them are read, there's a public trial, the sentence is read aloud. We do all these rituals to say this person is either guilty or innocent. We do what's called conferring deviance, right? Then we send them to prison, we never think about them again. There's not a re-entry ritual, right? I don't know, I've watched a bunch of prison movies, I can't name any of them, of course, but I can see in my head this image of the person leaving prison, and they're walking in the clothes that they came in on, and they're carrying a little bag, right? They walk up and there's a gate, and they go, right? And then they step outside and they look down a dusty road, and there's no one there, look down a dusty road, there's no one there, and they're just on their own. There's no one there to see them showing that completion. So we can know if we look at the prison records, here's how many people were entered the prison. Here's the current prison population. So if we do the math, we can tell that over some period, X number of people are no longer in the prison. We subtract from that the people who died in prison, and we can get some record of the number of people who left. But we don't know that very well. And that's a really good question. Because one of the things that we really don't know about historically is that post-imprisonment life and the effect that imprisonment had on people. Because it's profound. We know that today. We don't know what was happening 100 years ago. So Caledonia, by sort of transitioning from a plantation to a prison, undergoes a very familiar transition. You'll probably have heard of Parchman Farm in Mississippi, also a plantation, became a prison. Angola in Louisiana, also a plantation that became a prison. And again, I know I sound like a broken record. It's not me saying it. They actually turned the plantations into prisons. They did it very deliberately. The infrastructure was there, the potential population was there, and it was a deliberate act. I just grabbed a couple of quotations, sort of competing quotations about the conditions of some of these prison camps. You can guess which one is from the government report about how well these camps were functioning. Well-fed, well-clothed, and have very comfortable quarters. And then a journalist goes out there, her name is Rebecca Harding Davis, and she finds that the men were tightly boxed for the night with no possible chance to obtain air or light, and the conditions were squalid and horrifying. I mentioned about the 10% mortality rate. They ate, based on the food they ate, they don't appear to have been at risk of malnutrition, but I assume that they were not fed particularly well. They did have green vegetables like peas. They ate, they drank a lot of coffee. They had cornbread and molasses. They explained the deaths that were happening as a result of disease, malnutrition. Tuberculosis was a big problem. And in the South, around this time generally, there was a good degree of malnutrition because people ate a lot of corn and not a lot else. And I guess corn doesn't have a lot of niacin in it. And so people in the South, many children in particular, had a niacin deficiency that was called pellagra. And there's actually a pioneering, and I'm just apologies for my father, who's a public health scholar, and I'm about to destroy his public health. I felt poorly and incompletely. There's a sort of a pioneering couple who during the 1920s, and this is the progressive era, right, with the capital P, when lots of people were sort of working with public health initiatives and sanitation initiatives and learning about communicable diseases, people thought pellagra was communicable. And so they were isolating these kids with these who were small and unhealthy, isolating them, which of course added to their misery, if not added to their unhealthiness. And in order to demonstrate that pellagra was not communicable, this couple would draw blood from these children and inject it into themselves in a public way, which I assume the public health professional in the room would advise against, in a general sense, but which sort of shows the extent to which these people were trying to educate people about eating healthfully. The way that prison officials explained the deaths that were happening in these camps was by blaming, quote, proverbially improvident Negroes who are diseased by a life of vicious indulgence and then have to live in these crowded and unhygienic conditions. So they do add that there's crowding and a lack of hygiene, but they lay the blame for their own deaths at the feet of African American prisoners based on what they say out loud, and you're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud, right? Based on what they say out loud is proverbially improvident. A story, a stereotype. They say, hey, my stereotype about them is that they're improvident. Therefore, in real life, they are dying at a greater rate than white prisoners. So an odd sort of admission of the role of racism in the determination that they still put down on paper to make. At the time that this prison system is slowly growing, and one of the things to bear in mind about this system is that as horrifying as it was, as racist as it was, as much as black people were imprisoned and punished disproportionately, it pales in comparison to our rates of incarceration today. And we really don't see the rise in incarceration that we're experiencing today. And we're de-incarcerating just a little bit, right? We sort of flattened the line out. But the rise that takes place in the early 90s is vast. And so in terms of raw numbers, we don't have anything close, and in terms of proportion, we don't have anything close. But we do have other mechanisms at the time that now most people would consider inappropriate, unconscionable and inappropriate, other mechanisms that are acting to control and traumatize black people and black families and black communities. And of course, I'll talk a bit about one of the most prominent ones. Can you just tell me though what you see here? What's the first thing that pops into your head when you look at this image?
Bunch of colored dots.
Zero
It's
correlation.
North Carolina,
Yeah.
right? This is our state. This is New Hanover County down here, Wilmington, right? So Bertie up here, Ashe County, Cherokee.
Yeah.
It's North Carolina. This is North Carolina as described by lynchings. Each of these dots represents a lynching. And lynching was an important tool that was used by white supremacists to kill black people, to drive them out of their own communities, to dissipate their wealth, to traumatize their children, and oddly to compel them to stay. One of the ironies, if that's the right word, of the way in which I suppose particularly wealthy white landowners operated at the time was that they desperately want black labor. We've created a prison system to compel and constrain black people to keep them around and laboring for us, yet we also want to harm them and to do things that seek to drive them out. And so that sort of doubleness is at least indicative of one of the sort of unsustainable and cruel ironies of white supremacy, is the desire to expel and the desire to confine that are sort of taking place at the same time.
What do the different colors represent?
The colors represent decades. I struggle with this image because of the colors. But the program that I used to do it just assigned different colors sort of on a random way to different. And actually this is part of a digital project that I'm working on with my students at Carolina called A Red Record, where we're trying to map and contextualize every lynching that took place in the former Confederacy. And we started with North Carolina because we were here, and this was an opportunity for me to talk to my students about their hometowns, and we had students in that class from Salisbury who had played baseball in the field were these spectacular and horrific. And when I say spectacular, I don't mean great, I mean the spectacle, and meant to be seen and meant to be experienced, where these lynchings took place. They had gone to high school right there, and so it's an opportunity for people to kind of rethink about their home communities. North Carolina also had, we think, only about 175 lynchings. When I say only, I don't mean to diminish their power and traumatic effect, but in comparison with other southern states, it's 10% or less of what happened in Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida. I think only Virginia had fewer lynchings. But the reason that I show you this map is because it's intended to demonstrate that despite the fact that there were, quote, only 175 of these incidents, that they were widespread, and that anywhere you were in the state, somewhere near you, a lynching had taken place. Somewhere within your lifetime or your parents' lifetime. And we don't know a great deal about the specific traumatic effects of lynchings, but we do know that they had traumatic effects on families, and we know that they had traumatic effects on communities. We know that in our sort of recent revisions of how the Great Migration worked, we know that the Great Migration wasn't just about eager African Americans looking for opportunities in cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. We know it was also about people being driven from their homes, having to sneak out at night under threat of violence to go into these spaces that were often hostile as well, to try to just put something together and put some food on the table. And lynching was an important part of that. We had 5 lynchings that we know about in Orange County. There's been a recent effort, as you well know, by the Equal Justice Initiative to document and memorialize those lynchings. And the copper markers are in Alabama right now, sort of waiting to be claimed, and maybe James Williams will talk to you about that effort which he's leading in Orange County. But there's only one for us in Orange County. And the reason there's only one is because the Equal Justice Initiative started their count in 1877. And we know of 4 lynchings that took place between 1865 and 1870. And so one of the things that James Williams and that group is trying to do is think about how to contextualize and memorialize around this question, and making sure that everyone is named and remembered, and not just this one person. This one person, his name was Manly Macaulay. You all know the name Macaulay from the Macaulay-Cameron Historic District. I think my older brother was born on Macaulay Street. Manly Macaulay was an African-American man, and it is very likely, though we do not have documentation, that the reason he has the last name Macaulay is that one of his ancestors, at least, was enslaved by the Macaulay family. He was an 18-year-old young man, boy, who was working at the family, who was working for a man named Milton Brewer in Orange County. Brewer was, in 1898, one of a diminishing number of Republican sympathizers, party members. He was a white farmer and a Republican at a time when Republicans were growing more and more uncomfortable. Now, I mentioned this arc of Democrats trying to displace Republicans in the South, and in North Carolina, the Republican Party kind of holds on longer than it does in many other southern states. And in 1898, Manly Macaulay, at least according to these sources, and I meant to mention this before, I'll mention it now, there were strong and influential African-American owned and published newspapers in North Carolina. We have the best documentary record of them starting in the 1930s and 40s. And by the 1930s and 40s, the number of incidences of lynchings was in decline. So we don't have as much of a documentary record from black authored sources about lynchings as we do from white authored sources. And I probably don't have to tell you why that's a problem. In 1898, the News and Observer, our paper of record, is publishing racist editorials about the Republican Party, about what they call Negro rule. There's an infamous rendering of an African-American person as a bat hovering over the state. The NNO is actively involved in pushing us forward into sort of crystalline, strong Jim Crow. And so when we're reading accounts of lynchings in white newspapers, we have to bear in mind that these are being written by white people, often in the service of narratives that are helping this white political experiment with white supremacy. And we see that in some of this coverage. And I'll explain and read a little bit to those who can't see this text. Manly Macaulay is described as eloping with the white wife of this man, Milton Brewer. Her name is Maggie Brewer. And they escape together, are captured by a group of some kind that may have included the husband. And either that group or another group that intercepts the first group brings Manly Macaulay to somewhere outside Carborough, and it's described in different kinds of language, and they hang him and kill him. They lynch him. It's described as taking place in Callavander. It's described as taking place 3 miles west of Chapel Hill. And so it's very hard to pinpoint exactly where it was. It's outside of Carborough. And one paper, I think this is from Kinston, they explain to their readers the context that they should be understanding this event in. They say that the woman could stoop so low as to elope with a Negro, and they do not capitalize the word Negro, and this was deliberate. Black sources would use the word Negro to describe African Americans as well, and they would capitalize it as a sign of respect for their personhood. So choosing to not capitalize it is deliberate. It's actually written about by H.L. Mencken, Du Bois, and a number of contemporary observers. That a woman could stoop so low as to elope with a Negro seems impossible, but the woman was born of a family who winked at social equality and thought that the day when the white man and the Negro would be socially equal was not far distant. She married a man who entertained the same views, and they lived happily together. But one day the man came home to find that his wife had eloped with a Negro farmhand. The woman is now at the home of her parents in Orange County, and the Negro returned to his community to be lynched by a mob of indignant white men. So, again, sort of saying the quiet part out loud, sort of explaining, we find this relationship unacceptable, we find this family's posture on race unacceptable, this is the kind of natural consequence of that kind of relationship and of the posture. And this happened a week before the elections in 1898. And it happened to the wife of a Republican. And it happened a week before the biracial fusionist government in Wilmington was expelled by force in the only successful coup on American soil and replaced by a white supremacist Republican, white supremacist Democratic local government. And to add to that notice, you probably know the first thing that they do in Wilmington is destroy the black press, right? So they're explaining the point of lynching. The point of lynching is to erase any belief people might have in the idea of a kind of biracial cooperation or a future in which black people have the same kind of personhood as white people. And so to readers who might not otherwise have put that together, we have an explanation that they can then pass on to their neighbors, to their friends, to their children. And then I include this note, because here we have in the first paragraph, first of all, an editor who decides to call this an unfortunate affair and then declare it is to be hoped that the matter is now at an end. This sort of like, let's move on, this thing happened. We have the members of the mob are named here. They were arrested. Charges were immediately dismissed. Rel Du Lloyd, Walter Neville, Milton Brewer, and Jesse King, all of Chapel Hill Township. And the descendant of Walter Neville, who still lives in the area, talks about this incident. And I haven't talked to him personally, but he's talked to some historians who are working on it, and he's sort of aware of this local knowledge that has been passed So this is our part of the story. This is the particular area's part of the story. Yeah.
Do you have any, was there any reporting in the black press?
Not that I'm aware of. I know more about the black press in the 30s and 40s than I do about their operation in the 1890s. The black editor who was operating the newspaper in Wilmington might not have had time to comment on this particular story, but the reason why he was attacked was because of his editorializing about race. And so there were people who were willing to make this particular commentary. It's a really good question, and actually, because of the situation of it, it wouldn't be hard to at least see if we have a documentary record, to just to look the day after, or a couple days after, and see what's available. The digital records of African American North Carolina newspapers, like I said, are stronger once you get later in the 20th century, but it would be discoverable. So I'll try to look that up. That's a good question. Well, one sort of general the black press responded differently to, well, not differently, in sort of various ways to various kinds of violent, racist violence. The death penalty was on the table as something that was discussed by African American presses. Lynching was certainly discussed and condemned. Lewis Austin, who edited the Carolina Times in Durham, I think he edited it between 1926 and 1971 maybe for a really long span of years, editorialized very strongly about lynching and called out in very direct terms were some of the rationales for lynching. He once published a picture of a lynching victim and said, "This is what they mean when they say states' rights." That generic phrase that is sort of implied is some sense of just don't tread on me, whereas when you say you have a right, you have to finish that sentence, right? You have a right to do something, and he was calling them out.
And is there collaboration within the lynching museum that just opened? Because they're identifying, they're taking soil from these sites, so I'm imagining they have quite a research capacity.
They are partnering with local groups to sort of make use of local research capacities. I think what they're doing is great. When they started doing it, I reached out to them to try to talk about sort of what their methodology was, and they were very polite, but declined to sort of share their data. And so I'm not entirely sure. My guess is that they're working from some of the existing historic sources. The NAACP, Tuskegee Institute, and the Chicago Defender collated and published lists of lynching victims, and those have remained the reliable resources that people have used to talk about the phenomenon. And some of them might suffer from the, well, I'm not sure. There was a lynching that took place in Chatham, and they just got his name wrong. And I don't know if that's because he was reported in the white press as being named one thing and not the other, but you know, he's got the wrong name engraved on a copper marker in Alabama. And so there's some issues that will, I think, need to be addressed. And I think that the way that they'll be addressed is with local partnerships and people who are invested. Because one of the things about lynching in particular, because it's underdocumented, is that you learn a lot. Once you start talking about it, you learn a lot from people who have family stories and sort of personal knowledge that never showed up in a newspaper. Yeah. But the James Williams, the group that him and Renee Price are running, is in active conversation with the EJI. And I think the EJI is partnering with them to. And one of the things that we're sort of trying to do, and I'm helping them just a very little bit, is to find a reliable location to get that soil from, because it's not really clear, you know, really where it is, right?
When was the most recent lynching in North Carolina?
So that's a really powerful question, because lynching, when these groups were counting it, was no one ever settled on a particular definition, but people would say that it needed to be, a mob had to have done it to 3 or more people, there needed to be a death, and there needed to be some reference to justice or custom. What that meant is that if a bunch of white men killed a black person in a bar fight, that wouldn't be considered a lynching. That same group took them out of the bar and left a note on their body saying, "This is what happens when blank, blank, blank," then that is one. And people were making determinations about what counted. And there's a politics of counting things, and the reason activists at the time, like the NAACP for instance, was counting was that they wanted to reach 0. They wanted to shame Southerners into stopping this practice, and they wanted to get to a point where they could say, we succeeded, we have solved this. So, the last documented one that sort of exists in the record takes place in 1946. The last 2 people lynched in North Carolina were both veterans of World War II. It's a common story in civil rights and racial conflict narratives where you have African American men who have gone overseas to fight for freedom, and they come back, and are not able to eat in the restaurant in their hometown. They are treated dismissively by white people of any kind, or white people of power of some kind in their communities, because they're not willing to behave in a way that purports with white expectations for their behavior.
So are you saying that a lynching, lynching doesn't necessarily mean hanging somebody?
Yes, lynching does not necessarily mean hanging somebody. And one of the parts of this history that I wrestle with is the possibility for this kind of fascination with the violence. And I'm not sure how to deal with that, and I've thought about it. I don't show images of lynchings, for instance, because those images were used to traumatize people. And I try to talk about it in a way that doesn't appear to celebrate the violence or to relish it in any way. But the violence and its goriness, the pain and suffering is an important part of the story as well. Does not have to be a hanging, although the use of the noose, it was an obvious effort by mobs to legitimize themselves by making the hanging seem like something that's quasi-official. And it's been discussed as being extra legal. That's the sort of phrase that scholars have often used about lynching. I would suggest that it was more obviously just kind of legal, period. Officers of the law were often involved in lynchings in one way or another. And this isn't to tar everyone with the same brush. Occasionally sheriffs did prevent mobs from taking people from jails. Occasionally they did protect their charges. But coroners who came to lynching sites after the lynching, the coroner as an officer of the law would use that infamous phrase that this person was murdered at the hands of parties unknown. There was one person in North Carolina who was pursued by a posse for days and days through eastern North Carolina, and he finally dies. He dies because he has been shot, and he has been attacked by dogs, and he's exhausted and is being chased by a mob. And the coroner is there with a crowd of people around him. And the newspaper reports say they were unable to determine any members of the mob. Now that's the flip side of that is just publishing their names. And so it's, which is it? Are we protecting their anonymity, or are we just saying it and not doing anything about it? And both was true depending on the circumstance. But that was a lynching. And then sometimes people were shot, they were burned, otherwise murdered. But the noose carries with it some symbolism that it was often used, but not always. Yeah. And people were, they're tied to a tree and shot. There are a lot of gory instances. Speaking of the law, I will mention, as a result of this complicity by law enforcement, 0.08% of lynchings in the South result in convictions.
Oh, wow.
So it's basically legal, right? It's more legal than almost any other infraction that I could possibly think of. Certainly more legal than vagrancy, and more legal than public drunkenness, and more legal than lots of crimes that we probably would expect to be treated with a degree of leniency. And in North Carolina, we have a couple instances where we appear to be slightly more serious about preventing lynchings than in some other places. In the 1920s, the National Guard, or it may still be the state militia at that point, starts using real bullets instead of blanks in their rifles. And the real part of that story is that they were using blanks until then, but they do actually start using real bullets. And there's a handful of people end up being charged and tried for lynching incidents. But the disposition really demonstrates that the trial is, in a way, there to kind of sanctify the process instead of actually punishing anyone. There's the Salisbury lynching in 1906 is committed by a mob. As usual, the reporting, or as often happens, the reporting says that they were, from out of town, right? There was some other people, outside agitators, right, who have come here to stir up trouble. There are a number of people arrested for jailbreaking because they destroyed the door of the jail in Salisbury to get these 3 people that they kill. And the person who ends up sort of taking the fall is a man named George Hall, and he's described as a drunk and a wife beater, and he's not from around here, and he's got a criminal record. He is convicted of jailbreaking and maybe conspiracy to commit murder, and he gets a 15-year sentence of hard labor in Central Prison. Not in Central Prison, but that will be his sort of home base. As we know, he is very likely to be whisked away somewhere else. But he's only in prison for a year when he escapes. And he runs away to South Carolina, he lives there for a year, and then he's captured and returned. He's extradited back to North Carolina. And at that point, I was reading this account, and I was kind of like, wow, okay, they were serious about this guy. And then the governor gives a speech, and he says, there's been a real miscarriage of justice. These people were killed, and only George Hall, he was the only person who ends up getting convicted as a result. And so he pardons him. A few years later, there's the lynching of a white man, and we get 25 indictments out of it. They have sort of the equivalent of the DA, the solicitor is sort of and this is in Anson County, and they actually move the Superior Court to Vance County, I think, or it's Union County, which is right next door. And they go before the grand jury, and they've been charged with murder. Lynching itself was not a crime, right? So they had to charge the details, jailbreaking, kidnapping, murder, that kind of thing. Lynching itself does not become a crime. And it's not a federal crime either, as we know, because did the Senate just vote on this in the previous term, and the House didn't get to take it up? We still have not passed federal anti-lynching legislation. We did apologize for not doing it in 2006, but we haven't done it. Those of you who have kids know the difference between saying you're sorry and then actually making restitution for it, right? They go on trial, and I think this was in the neighborhood in 1915, let's say. And the first guy comes up for trial, and the grand jury won't indict. And the second guy comes up for trial, and the grand jury won't indict. And the third guy comes up for trial, and the grand jury won't indict. And the judge says to the solicitor, listen, it should be obvious to you what's happening here. You're simply not going to get an indictment. And you should also know that the reason they have a legal team of 15 defense attorneys is because there's a slush fund that's been set up by residents of Anson and Union County. I'm forgetting the county names, forgive me. And they set up a defense fund. They set up a GoFundMe for members of a lynch mob to fund their defense. And then the result was that the prosecutor then just declines to continue to seek the indictments, and they all go free. So there was a way in which members of lynch mobs were sometimes drawn into the inconvenience of having to go through a public process of having the acceptability of lynching declared in a court, as opposed to just sort of being ignored. Something sort of similar happened in this case. This is Alvin Mansell. This is from a picture, I presume it was taken when he entered prison in 1925, but it appears in a kind of remarkable little volume that was published in 1929 by a journalist named Nell Battle Lewis. She worked at the News and Observer. You may recognize the name Battle. She was maybe the niece of Kemp Plummer Battle, who's got his name on some rocks on the Carolina campus, was a former president of the University of North Carolina. Nell Battle Lewis started writing in the women's pages, right? Sort of society pages in the News and Observer, and was not happy at all about her relegation to the women's pages, and started writing these very forceful columns. Was eventually moved onto the opinion page, page 4 in the NNO. She wrote a column called Incidentally, and she often wrote about the death penalty. She also wrote about literacy, women's rights, the vote before it happened, politics of all kinds. She was very much a Renaissance woman, I suppose. I don't know what that term even means, to be honest. But she was an activist and a sort of progressive agitator at a time when women were expected to be resigned to the women's pages. And she wrote very forcefully about the death penalty, called it barbaric, said it was unchristian. She said it was stupid, pointed out all of these arguments that we know about the death penalty and incarceration generally today, which to my mind, have kind of a modern sheen because we hear them so often, that the death penalty tends to happen in the context of neglect by a defense attorney. An assigned attorney doesn't have time to work on the case. Someone's falling asleep at the defense table. The person themselves is experiencing mental illness. And the people today who are executed are the most unlucky of an already unlucky group of people, right? Something like 80–90% of the executions that take place in this country today happen in a handful of prosecutorial districts in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Louisiana. If you're ever going to murder anyone, just don't do it in Harris County, Texas, and you're likely to at least not get a death sentence. You may spend the rest of your life in prison, but you certainly won't end up with a death sentence. Nell Battle Lewis made this little book that was published by the State Board of Charities and Public Welfare, which is sort of maybe a progressive arm of the government that was intended to draw attention to poverty and the results of neglect. And so she put 26 death row inmates in it and detailed their IQs, which we know are not a good measure of intelligence, but they were being taken at the time, their IQs, their mental capacities, their home lives, their background, and every single one of these people had grown up and lived in misery, in poverty, and hunger, with neglectful or abusive parents. They were suffering from diseases of addiction. They were suffering from what appeared to be sort of clear evidence of mental illness, such as hearing voices, or other things of that nature. And Alvin Mansell appears as one of the people who's described. There was a white woman, who was selling flowers at a sanitarium, a place where people are recovering from tuberculosis in the mountains outside of Asheville. She was attacked and raped in what was undoubtedly a brutal crime. And when she reports the crime to sheriff's deputies, she describes her assailant as a light-skinned African-American man. Alvin Mansell is arrested for the crime. And historic photographs can be confusing because they are taken, I mean, this is almost 100 years old, it's been copied and reproduced, it's got that sort of historic, the color of the paper this is printed on, so we really can't look at a picture like this and always say with certainty that the person looks as they're depicted, but we know at a minimum that this 17-year-old person is not middle-aged, and we can suppose that he's not light-skinned. And so it seems clear that he is not the person who did this crime. And we can't say with certainty, we don't know. But he is convicted. And he's convicted on the testimony of the woman, the victim of the crime, who points him out in court. And North Carolina at the time has 4 mandatory death sentences: murder, rape, arson, and burglary. If you receive a conviction for any of those 4 crimes, you will receive an automatic death sentence. So today, if you go on trial for your life, or you go on trial for a capital eligible, death eligible crime, you have the sort of guilt phase, and then you have a separate phase to determine whether or not you get a death sentence. This is not the case at this time. You have a mandatory death sentence upon conviction. So he is sentenced to death for rape, and he goes to death row. And I learned about him a number of years ago, and I would sort of tell the story because, well, I guess along his way to receiving that death sentence, and I've told it backwards and ruined it, but a mob attacks the jail in Asheville, and they break down the door, and they try to get Alvin Mansell. But the sheriffs have actually taken him to Charlotte. They've hidden him somewhere else. So he is protected. When he comes back a day, 2 days later, and receives his death sentence, 2 sets of letters pour into the governor's office, asking for mercy. One is a set of letters about Alvin Mansell himself, including, and I haven't seen the letter, but it was written that it existed, including maybe a letter from Lucy Carty, the woman who was assaulted. And then there's twice as many letters about the members of the lynch mob who have been arrested. And so it's a community that is once tortured about the fact that the obviously innocent person has received a death penalty, and trying to make sure that the people who tried to lynch him don't get punished. But he goes to death row. And when I learned about this many years ago, I didn't know anything more about what happened to him. I knew, though, that he was not executed, because he did not turn up in that list. And so later, when the Mormons digitized all of these resources in Ancestry.com and newspapers.com, we suddenly have access to all of this other information. And so I found him in a census in 1930, and he was living in a residence, a domicile, with about 24 other black men between the age of 16 and 30. Where was he? He was in prison. He was in prison, exactly. And he didn't say it was a prison, he just said it was a residence, and it took me a minute. So, okay, so he was in prison in 1930, and then I found his commutation record from that same year. He was released. He was commuted first down to life imprisonment, and then released that same year. And this happened kind of quietly. And then I couldn't find him, and then he turns up in a city directory in Cleveland, South Carolina. And I think it's him because this same person was born in Cleveland, South Carolina, and I learned that from this, there we go. I learned that from this document. So someone with the same name and the same place of birth was working in a bakery with a person with a woman's first name and his last name. Maybe a mother, maybe a sister, an aunt, someone. Then I couldn't find him. I thought he might have turned up in World War II, but I couldn't find records of that. But then, and so I thought that was it for him. But then I found a record of a person named Alvin Mansell with his middle initial, his date of birth, his birthplace in Cleveland, South Carolina, and he was living in a middle-class black neighborhood in Connecticut. And he was commuting to work as a doorman at the United Nations building. Wow. And he died in 2001. I might have walked past him. I lived in Manhattan in 2001. And I was kind of touristy then. I wasn't cool. I might have gone to the UN. So whenever I think about, when we look at this sepia image, right, and we think about historic lynchings and we think about the death penalty and the sort of grim old days, I remember that he might have opened the door for me when I was 19. And the final little story I want to tell you about sort of the lethal punishment is about a man named Raleigh Speller. Raleigh Speller was an African-American man arrested in 1947 for rape. His victim was white. 80% of people executed in North Carolina between the end of the Civil War and 1961 are African-Americans. The majority of them, vast majority, have white victims. There are a handful of American Indians who are also executed during this period. There is not a white person who is executed for a crime against a black victim. And that idea, what people in the legal profession call I hinted that I was going to use some arcane term that I've now forgotten. But the relationship between the sort of victim-offender relationship sort of operates in this kind of pyramidal way, where if you're a black male offender with a white female victim, that white female victim is valued the most highly, and you're the most likely to receive harsh punishment, whereas a black female victim is valued the lowest as far as the likelihood of the person who acts against her. And so we have very strongly in the Jim Crow era, the relationship between a black male offender and a female victim is the thing that's the most likely to result in a death penalty and an execution. You are considered to be deserving of the least amount of mercy. But Raleigh Speller tells a story about what happened in his trial. He's from Bertie County, and Bertie County was and remains a majority black county in North Carolina. It's about, I believe, about 60% African American. And he's arrested near, it's not actually too far, so in Caledonia, I should have mentioned this earlier. Caledonia is right near Tillery, which is actually a historic African American community with an interesting history of activism. That's in Halifax County, not too far from Bertie County. And what Raleigh Speller says, what his attorneys argue, and he makes this case 3 times before the North Carolina Supreme Court, and he tries to make it before the Supreme Court of the United States, but they deny him, they won't hear the case. He says that African Americans are systematically excluded from juries in Bertie County, despite the fact that they're majority of the population. And he says that that means that his right to having a jury trial of his peers has been violated. And they call the clerk of court in this case, and the clerk describes how they select juries in Bertie County. So, and I have to have this explained to me, you all probably better than me, but there's a jury pool, which is the group of eligible jurors, right? And then from that jury pool, you select a smaller group, and then from that group, you get your 12 people, or whatever it is. And what they said was that the way they determine the eligible jurors, people who might be selected to be on the juries, they have this box, and the box is kind of complicated. It's got these 2 sides and a lock on it, and the lock is always locked, and the key is kept in the sheriff's drawer. It's a very sturdy box. And they bring the box out in a public hearing, and they have a child, and they blindfold the child, and they lead the child to the box, and the box is opened in this complicated way, and the sheriff lumbering over to open the box, and there's this little child trying to get to it. And the child draws a name that's written on a slip of paper from the box. The names of white eligible jurors are written in black ink. The names of black eligible jurors are written in red ink. When a name written in red is drawn from the box, that juror is struck for reasons of insufficient intelligence, or low intelligence, or insufficient moral quality. And you don't need to explain that determination. That person is just struck, and there's no limit on the number of strikes you can make. This is what's called a facially race-neutral process. No one ever says we're striking them because we're black. And the clerk of court testifies that he's been working in Bertie County for 20 years, and there has never been a black person ever on a jury in Bertie County. And it's 60% majority black county. Raleigh Speller has his appeal denied, and he's executed. Raleigh Speller is one of the last people executed in the state of North Carolina. The death penalty starts dwindling by the 1940s. The last person in North Carolina executed is an African-American man with a white victim. He's executed in 1961. And we don't have another execution until the 1980s. During this period of time, between 1961 and 1980, we have the Civil Rights Movement. We have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We have the backlash against the Civil Rights Movement. And we have a Supreme Court case that in 1972, Furman v. Georgia, says that the death penalty in the United States violates the 8th Amendment because it's cruel and unusual. And the important part is the unusual part. And what the justices say is that it happens so rarely that when it happens, it's about like being struck by lightning. And the only explanation for who gets struck is race. The Supreme Court says very directly that the determination about whether or not you die is based on your race. But they leave the door open for modification. And because this is happening in the early 1970s, the backlash against the Civil Rights Movement is underway, and North Carolina is among many states that immediately rewrite our statutes to make them more race neutral, and we have the death penalty back. And the first person executed in North Carolina in the 1980s is a white woman, incidentally. When we think about the sort of end of lynching, of that last lynching that may have taken place in 1946, and of the sort of end of the death penalty, The death penalty in North Carolina, that we have not had an execution since 2006. And that's because of a series of complications and lawsuits and prohibitions and other problems. And to my mind, it's not likely to be back anytime soon. But we have to think about these as being only the sort of brightest and those incandescently awful elements of a system that was built up over many generations and many years and built up very deliberately. That includes some of the other elements that I've included here. And when Carol invited me to come here, she said that you had watched 13th and that you were just interested in having a kind of conversation about these issues generally. And so I sort of put these on the table as elements of a much bigger conversation and the potential spaces where productive conversations can happen on the local level about how to start to address some of these interrelated issues and problems. In today's prisons in North Carolina, we have about 160,000 people who are involved in the prison system in some way. That includes people on parole and probation. We've got maybe 60,000 people in prisons and jails in the state. That includes about 37,000 people in our state prisons, some federal prisons, youth facilities, and others. And the people in those states' prisons work. And they have to work if there's a job available for them. And if they don't work, they can be punished. People get paid between $1 and $5 a day, maybe averaging about $3 a day to do a variety of jobs. And they do jobs in the prison, like cutting hair, doing laundry, preparing meals. And they do jobs outside of the prison, growing vegetables in Caledonia, working in a paint factory in Johnson County, painting roads, picking up litter on the side of the road, that kind of thing. And all these jobs are compelled. And our prison population in North Carolina is in slight decline, and it actually was fairly stable by the middle and the late 1990s when other populations were still exploding. But as this graphic shows you, we have very little to pat our backs about as far as where we stand in terms of incarceration. These are some comparisons between the United States, which incarcerates at a slightly higher per 100,000 population than does North Carolina, which comes in second. And then below North Carolina we have the United Kingdom, Portugal, Luxembourg, Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Almost all 50 states in the United States incarcerate at a higher rate internationally than other countries. And of course here in the United States we've got more prisoners in our prisons and jails than China, which has a significantly higher population. So I'll end just by sort of pointing that out, that here we have one of the results of this sort of poisonous combination between race-based enslavement, between the impulse to confine, and between that little clause in the 13th Amendment that lets people work if they're doing it in the context of a felony conviction. Thank you very much for tolerating me. And I'm happy to do what I can to answer questions or to facilitate conversation or whatever it is might be desirable if I haven't already ruined everybody's Sunday.
One goes back to the beginning of your talk when you were talking about that free-thinking writer.
Nell Bell Lewis?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I had heard a talk many, many years ago that has stuck with me about going back to the concept of